most human beings have genuinely forgotten who they are, and they've forgotten how they're actually connected with the universe. Your own sense of self-importance, your own ego, is the thing that's causing your misery, is the thing that's making your life harder and harder. Personal development is amazing, and certainly what we've seen so far is really helping a lot of people. But if you don't add that spiritual layer, ultimately you're just teaching people how to be miserable in different ways. Spiritual development is about letting go of that sense of self and just flowing with the universal flow of life, connecting back to that one source, that oneness, that divine source, and shifting your importance away from yourself into that universal self. Everything is connected to that higher power. Everything in nature, certainly that you look around you, is already in perfect harmony with it. In fact, you could argue that even your body is in perfect harmony. The only thing that is not connected is your mind. The ultimate truth that is true for all people at all times and in all places is... Yeah, I think it all just started in my late teens when I myself started getting more interested in the underlying wisdom of the religious tradition that I was born into. So I was born into a moderately religious family. I call it the Sunday Sikhs. You know, we go to the Gurdwara, the Sikh temple on the Sunday, and then Monday to Saturday, you just get on with your normal life. And it was one of those things that I never really questioned as a child, just grew up in this tradition. But I think in my late teenage years, I just became a little bit more fascinated with what was the wisdom. What are we really learning? What's some of the truths that are there? And it wasn't until my very early 20s, I think I was 20 or 21, when I actually met who I call now one of my first mentors, who really opened my eyes to some of the teachings that were in the religion that I belong to. And it just completely blew me away. It just completely changed my entire perspective on what I thought I knew versus what was really going on. And he introduced me to things like meditation, and I started reading into the scripture, trying to understand some of the really deep concepts. And it had such a transformative impact on my life. The natural outcome of that was, well, why don't more people know about this? Even just within my own tradition, I couldn't believe the disconnect between what the wisdom was actually saying and what I was seeing in the everyday religious practices in the Sikh temples. I saw this huge disparity, and I just thought, why don't I do something about it? You know, and for me, from my IT and tech background in my career, starting a YouTube channel and making use of emerging social media technologies at the time just seemed like a natural way for me to talk about some of the things that I had learned, for no other reason than to just say, you know, I think more people could benefit in the same way that my life had been changed. And that was really just the start of it.
Yeah, it bodes to a very interesting point where somehow, and my mind's still yet to be made up on what's actually going on for a younger generation, because on some ways, the future generations are, not to say that capitalism is the antithesis of spirituality, that's definitely not the case, but they're sort of dropping out of like capitalistic beliefs, and they're more open and connected to some metaphysical beliefs in that regard. But then there is a large contingent, and this is where my mind's still yet to be made up, where, you know, they're a bit more apathetic to the whole situation at large as well. And so I'm not entirely sure if the younger generation is more spiritual or, you know, completely dropping out of everything and not entirely spiritual. And this is a gross generalization, so pardon me for that. But yeah, I think it speaks volumes into, like, even just feeling into my own children, you know, seeing how much English they're picking up versus how much of their mother tongue they're picking up. And, you know, a lot of, you know, our particular religion, it helps to have that language under your belt. And if you don't have the language, you kind of end up a little bit outside is probably the word, and unable to connect as much. And so it's interesting feeling into, yeah, just how deep tradition can run in certain ways. And it comes with the best of intentions to sort of bring people into the fold culturally, right? But then in some ways, there's a sense of alienation that ends up happening in some way or another, which is a bit painful to sort of say, right?
Yeah, I think what the younger generations have access to now is they have access to so much more information than we ever did growing up, and certainly any previous generations. And what that does is that it gives them so many more options. It widens their understanding of the world, and then naturally where they fit into the world. They don't necessarily just see themselves as just following the traditional path that whatever their family or their culture or society tells them to. When they see so many different options, then really for them, they understand that they can go down any one of those paths. And the conflict there then comes, do I then feel like I'm removing myself from my own heritage, my own culture? Have I explored that enough? Or do I just go for the easier option where I can just learn things by simply listening to a podcast or watching a video on
Mm.
YouTube? You know, can I do it in a language that makes sense to me? And I think this is a very interesting time that we're in. And your observation around the fact that is the younger generation now starting to reject a little bit of capitalism. I don't know if that's any truer than it has been before. There have always been a number of people that have just found that the world and the material world doesn't quite satisfy them, and then they start looking for answers. I mean, you go right back to, you know, the hippie movement back in the 60s and the 70s. There was huge swathes of people traveling to India and finding a rishi or a guru of some sort. So I think there's always been a certain number of people within society that have just wanted to look for something deeper. And now it's just how they go about doing it. Now they have access to simply open up something on the internet or open an app, and they can instantly access it. And I think that's the only real difference, that the time that's needed to go and find that information has now massively been reduced. And that's a bonus for everyone. That's a win for everyone,
Well,
I
let me
think.
ask you about spirituality in general, because your channel's obviously being very well received. And what do you draw from, like, when you zoom out a little bit, what does that mean to you in terms of potentially people's hunger for what you're teaching?
I think with my own YouTube channel, what I've found is that there are so many people who have not been shown that there is a way to live spiritually whilst going about their daily lives. And that's one of the things that I love about the tradition that I come from, is that it was designed specifically for people with everyday lives. It's not a tradition that's made by monks or for monks. It's really just for people who need to be shown, how do I deal with the everyday challenges of family life, running a home, pursuing a job and a career, and trying to generate wealth? How do I do all of those things and not get sucked into it in a way that my emotions and my mental state gets drained by those things? How do I sort of stay afloat and still continue my daily interactions? And I think that's where people have really gravitated towards the work that I do, because that's literally what the Sikh tradition has almost specialized in, is actually finding a way to do that. And so people are finding a lot of relief and comfort knowing that there isn't this disconnect between people living their ordinary lives and pursuing spirituality at the same time. There's a very sweet spot, a union, if you like, between those two different ways of
Because
life.
that was an interesting point there, because I was reflecting on the Abrahamic religions. They go way back, right? And then you've kind of got Hinduism, which also goes potentially even further back. God knows, or the gods know. But then you've got I think just the vantage point of potentially being a younger religion. And that was going to be one of the questions, because even like Buddhism also emerges somewhat as a younger faith as well in some ways. Not as young, but nonetheless. And is there a certain I don't want to say the word advantage, but it's sort of, and I'm looking for a better word in there, but I think you get the gist of what I'm trying to ask, is being, like you said, it's easier for a homemaker to adopt some of the principles that you're learning and sharing, and that makes it a bit more accessible potentially.
Yeah, I think I struggle with looking at the Sikh tradition as a younger religion, because when you study the wisdom, it's very clear that it's timeless wisdom that it's talking about. So it's not something that has just emerged out of nowhere. It's not something that is just an amalgamation of different religions or a new idea. What I love about it is the fact that there is just an ultimate truth that is universal to all people in all places and at all times. And so this is really looking at how do you then go about refocusing your life back to that universal truth. And the one thing that the masters of this tradition certainly do is they make a comment on how people have forgotten how to really practice their religions, and they specifically speak to the primary religions at that time, which were the Islamic faith and the various variations of the Hindu tradition as well. And they're quite openly critical about how people have gotten lost in tribalism, in our religion versus your religion, in practices and rituals. And what the masters of this tradition were really trying to do was just bring people back and saying, look, this is not where the truth is. The truth is actually something that's deep within you. It's not in you aligning yourself with one religion or the other. Regardless of what religion you belong to, there's a universal truth, and most people seem to have forgotten that. And that's, I think, the advantage of the younger religion, is that it actually makes a commentary on how people have forgotten and are practicing certain things which are seen as being in opposition to a genuine spiritual path and a genuine spiritual practice.
Yeah, and there's an interesting perspective in there as well, because it's also, as a path, it actually doesn't espouse itself as the best path. It's everybody's entitled to their path, and this just happens to be mine. And bidding you well on yours as well actually is a core tenet there, right?
Absolutely. And I think there's a beautiful line that says, don't call the spiritual texts wrong, call those who don't practice them properly wrong. And that's a very clear understanding. Don't look down on other traditions. In fact, make some time to actually figure out, are you really learning those traditions properly? And that's just a call for anyone. Go back and look at your tradition. And I think that's one of the beautiful things about the masters of the Sikh tradition, is they were encouraging people, you don't need to convert to a different religion. Have a look at what your religion's really saying. And in fact, they were very well learned in various traditions, and they would go and explain to people, this is the true meaning of what the Quran is trying to say. This is the true meaning of what the ancient Vedas are trying to say. They would go back and encourage you, go back and look at what the truth is, because they weren't saying that there was multiple truths. One of the beautiful things is they weren't saying there were multiple truths. There is only one truth, but there may be multiple paths to get to that truth. And I think an analogy that works very well is if you're climbing up a mountain, there are many routes that you can take, but ultimately you're all going to reach the same summit. You're all going to get to the same peak. And so there isn't many truths, but there are many ways to approach that truth.
Hey there guys, we're about to dive in super deep, and just before we do, I just want to ask you quickly to take a moment please to hit subscribe to the channel. We are trying our best to promote positivity, promote wisdom, promote love, and just really get this juju and energy out into the world. At the moment of listening to this podcast, 95% of you are returning to the channel for a third, fourth, fifth listen, but haven't actually hit subscribe. So if you can do us a favor, please subscribe to the channel. It helps with everything we're doing around here. Our channel is literally powered by your subscription, and the power of love, power of positivity, power of wisdom, all championed and empowered by your subscription. So please take a moment to hit subscribe to the channel. Go on, back to today's episode. Yeah, and so do you feel, because I'm in the personal development space, and generally with like a heavy spiritual sort of bent with this channel as well. And do you feel like personal development in and of itself can cover most of the ground that spiritual development does? Or yeah, like, because there is a bit of a difference when you start to look a little bit deeper into there is a discrepancy. From the outside looking in, they look similar, spiritual development and personal development. But you know, I'm just curious as to what your thoughts are as to whether, yeah, people that potentially might be filling their lives with personal development don't need spiritual development then? Just open question, sorry.
I think we need clarity on ultimately what is spiritual development and what is the ultimate universal truth that applies to all people. And the truth of the matter is that most human beings have genuinely forgotten who they are, and they've forgotten how they're actually connected with the universe. And so once you begin to go down that path of trying to learn and understand, what have I forgotten? What am I missing? That's where the spiritual path will teach you that ultimately what you're missing is your entire focus seems to be on yourself, and that's leading to your own misery. Your own sense of self-importance, your own ego is the thing that's causing your misery, is the thing that's making your life harder and harder. And spiritual development is about letting go of that sense of self and just flowing with the universal flow of life, connecting back to that one source, that oneness, that divine source, and shifting your importance away from yourself into that universal self. Now, personal development, if it's not careful, is actually reinforcing that sense of self-importance. You need to go out there. You can achieve whatever you want. You need to go and aim for the best. You know, we talk about manifestation, law of attraction, and all of this is about me, me, me. And all the spiritual masters are looking back and just laughing at this way of thinking, saying, you're just reinforcing your ego, no different to how anyone does in the material world, that they're just going about and just trying to earn a lot of money or earn a lot of reputation for themselves and increase their standing in society. All of these things are just increasing the sense of self. So I think personal development is amazing, and certainly what we've seen so far is really helping a lot of people. But if you don't add that spiritual layer, ultimately you're just teaching people how to be miserable in different ways. Instead of chasing one thing, they're now chasing something else. Instead of chasing money, they're now chasing a certain state of mind, or they're told that they need to be relaxing so much all the time, or they always need to be aiming for being in this neutral yoga kind of like state, or they're not eating the right diet, they're not doing this, they're not doing it, and you're ultimately creating further anxieties in people by telling them how great their life can be, without really showing them what is it that they're missing. So I think personal development certainly leads to spiritual development, but it can also kind of go down the wrong path if it's not careful.
I really appreciate the way you've unpacked that. Actually, it's very clarifying, and really, really resonates. On the path, I think when you come to spiritual development as well, I wish I wasn't asking this question this way, but I find most people that crack open into it, there's usually a little bit of pain that brings them home to spirituality, would you say? And have you found that to be true? And what can you say to that?
It's really interesting. There's a particular verse that says that pain is the ultimate medicine, because without pain, you wouldn't have that impetus to go and start searching for that deeper truth. So it's a nice way to actually look at the difficulties that you're going through and saying, what am I learning with this? What is this teaching me? And I've noticed a lot of people who certainly watch our content, they're certainly coming from, I would say at least 50% of people who watch our channel are coming from some sort of personal trauma. And in fact, once you start to go down this spiritual path, you no longer judge that trauma. In fact, you're thankful for that trauma, because that brought you to this enlightenment. That brought you to this higher wisdom. That was the catalyst that actually started off your journey. So a lot of people who have genuinely healed themselves have healed themselves from the pain of that past that they were carrying before. So it's an unfortunate way for people to realize that they were holding on to something or relying on something, thinking that thing was going to give them happiness. And when that came crashing down, and they had to take a step back and look at their life and say, wait, what just happened? Why has that thing that I put all of my thought and love and hopes into, why is that thing not delivered the happiness that I thought it would? And that's the thing that kicks off that spiritual journey and saying, I'm missing something. I didn't quite look at that in the right way. There's something else that I need to be doing.
Yeah, and something else you need to be doing, and it feels kind of like something else you ought to place your connection in and to. Would you articulate it that way to some degree?
Yeah, you've looked at the world in the wrong way. And this is one of the beautiful things about the wisdom of oneness that I try to teach, which is that most of the world have not really understood their attachments. And without understanding your attachments, you cannot begin to develop a mindset that is essentially healthy. You have to understand that your way of attaching yourself to your children, to your loved one, to your job, to your health, we attach so many hopes to these things, thinking that if we just surround ourselves by all of these things, then hopefully everything will be okay and our life will be perfect. The reality is the wisdom teaches us that you have to surround yourself with these things because that's just what the human goes through. But you have to surround yourself in a way knowing that these things are essentially on weak foundations. It's almost like you're on a house of sand. Everything will eventually come crumbling down. Nothing lasts forever. Now, can you live a life where you have all these things around you, knowing that these things aren't going to last, and still be happy? Can you be happy knowing that your body is essentially deteriorating? Can you be happy knowing that your relationships are definitely not going to last? In one way or another, all relationships around you are not going to last. Can you be happy knowing that whatever circumstance that you're in your career is definitely going to change in some way in the future, maybe to your liking, maybe not to your liking? It's becoming comfortable with that unpredictability of life. That's really what the spiritual seeker is looking for, is remaining stable and steady whilst the world is falling to parts, falling to bits around.
I can understand why some people would be so attached to their attachments. Pardon me for putting it that way. When you share it, because it does seem a little bit more stoic when you're like, hey, everything around you is actually quicksand, and you know the impermanence of everything is not to be sort of missed and appreciated. And however, that can be at face value quite an overwhelming thought to brace yourself for, and hence the security blanket of our attachments. You know, to really confront that, it's quite the beast.
It really is, and this is why you really need to attach yourself to something else. If you don't attach yourself to something higher, something that really grounds you, then it can be quite scary. The real proof in the pudding is when you see people who've been practicing this wisdom for a while, and then things start going wrong in their life and they remain completely steady. The alternate being that a lot of people who practice spirituality, certainly religious people all the time, are faced with this dilemma that they think that they've been practicing good things all their life, and then something bad, quote unquote, happens in their life where, you know, there's a death of a family member, a loved one, or something goes wrong in their home, in their job, in their careers, and they're stuck with this dilemma, which is, well, why did that happen to me? I was one of the good ones. I was the one that was praying to God all the time. Why did God then do this to me? It's almost as though God has not kept up his end of the bargain, thinking that if they just continued to be religious in some way, that somehow they were protected from the things that were going to go wrong. And that's because they hadn't understood their attachments. Real spiritual wisdom is teaching you all the time, these things are not going to last. And that's something that you just have to be constantly confronted with on a daily basis. You have to recognize that, you have to be taught that, you have to be reminded that on a daily basis. And so you start becoming comfortable with the fact that things are constantly changing in life. And my definition of a good life is not that everything is stable around me. My definition of a good life, of a spiritual life, is that even though things are unstable, my mind remains steady. My emotions remain steady. I'm at peace regardless of what's happening around you. And the more and more I've learned that is really one of the best definitions of spirituality, that you are at bliss regardless of what's happening around you. And it sounds so simple, but that's literally the ultimate challenge.
Yeah. I don't say I get triggered by the word simple, but when you've got a spiritual development podcast, when someone says this is simple, part of you starts to like brace yourself for the simple, because wisdom's always simple.
I mean, I'm clear. I'm clear on that. It sounds simple, but that's literally one of the hardest things to achieve.
Yeah, simple is never easy. Is not to be conflated. Yeah, there's that. To dive a little bit deeper into the emotional bedrock of where we're at in this conversation, how do you deal with the heartache of not attaching to some of the things that are more tender, more dear to be attached to?
I think what's really interesting is how much spiritual wisdom you learn and how many things you practice, and then you still find yourself getting caught up in emotional turmoil. And it humbles you when you think you've got it all figured out, and you know, I'm teaching other people this wisdom, and then I catch myself thinking, hey, you got stuck here at this point. And you know, you with all the best intentions in the world, you can try as much as you can to keep your attachments at bay, but every now and then you see that you've caught yourself, and that's the point at which you realize that you've still got more to learn. You've still got more to do to figure out how to kind of navigate through this ocean of life. It is a daily practice. It's a daily practice and it's a daily struggle. And I think the key thing you have to do is you have to catch yourself when you're starting to experience negative emotions and you don't go down that trip. One of the things I find very interesting is we don't actually have a good definition of mental health. Right now, the whole world is always talking about mental health, and yet there is a very poor definition of what a healthy mind is. Whenever we talk about mental health, immediately people start talking about mental ill health. They talk about depression, anxiety, and things like that, almost as though that's how you define a healthy mind. But if you look at even some of the main sort of definitions of mental health, what they say is the ability to experience all emotions and still carry on with your daily life. And I think that's a very poor definition of mental health. The spiritual master would say that mental health is to remain at bliss regardless of what's happening around you in life. Not that you're supposed to go through anger, you're supposed to feel sad. You know, a lot of these personal development gurus and teachers are saying, experience all of your emotions. And that's actually not a healthy mind. So when you are on this spiritual path and you're trained in this way of thinking, you start to catch yourself when you're going down negative thoughts. When you see yourself getting emotionally drained, when you see yourself getting frustrated, and you know, anyone who's got kids will tell you how easy it is for your fuse to blow and for you to just kind of lose your temper. And then you catch yourself and you're like, oh, what did I do now? What was that? And I think that's where that spiritual wisdom and practice and training comes in. The more that you surround yourself with these teachings, the more you will start to notice every time that happens. And then over time, you can reduce how long that negative emotion stays with you. And eventually, hopefully, you can actually reduce how many times you even fall down those negative emotions. So I think that's where you start to develop a resilience towards some of those. I mean, even the word negative emotions is probably too strong a term, but I think we know what we mean by our frustrations, our obsessions, our cravings, our depressions, all of those things. You will know within yourself, this is not the best that you've ever felt. And I think when you start to create a clarity within your mind that this isn't who I am, this is not who I'm meant to be, very, very quickly you can start to move away from those things, because you're disassociating your inner peace with those emotions. You're not allowing those emotions to bombard you and stay with you for long. And I think that's a very important thing to recognize and to practice as you go about your daily life in everyday interactions.
Yeah, the mental health piece is huge, and it's interesting that we're having a conversation about spirituality and mental health emerges. For me, yeah, it's a big part of what drives my work is being aware of people's mental health state, and yet as I'm talking to you, it's like there is still a hint of surprise within me. It's like, yes, this is a spiritual development podcast, and we're talking about mental health. And it's like, yeah, but you do all that all the time yourself, Amrit. But it's interesting, right? Because I oftentimes reflect on, just, this is more marketing type sort of stuff, which what am I doing talking about that here? But, sometimes I think about like the ultimate mindset being spirituality and it having nothing to do with your mind, and it's just like, it's like go beyond even the medium of which you're trying to work with to trump, the ace in the hole sort of thing. I see you nodding along.
It's interesting you say that. I feel spirituality is everything to do with the mind. And I think there is the way to look at it is essentially let's try and define, or at least come to some kind of consensus around what we mean by spirituality. Certainly in any of the ancient Indian traditions, Hinduism, Buddhism, and Sikhism, Jainism, any of those, they will ultimately tell you that there is one truth and you need to merge with that higher truth, higher power, higher being. Call it what you want, call it God, whatever it is. I think all traditions are essentially trying to get you back into that godlike state where you're connected. Now, let's talk about that. What is the one thing that doesn't feel like God? What is the only thing that is not connected to God? And that's your mind. That's literally the only thing. Everything is connected to God. Everything is connected to that higher power. Everything in nature, certainly that you look around you, is already in perfect harmony with it. In fact, you could argue that even your body is in perfect harmony. You have no control over what your body is doing. Your body is just acting out the way that the universal higher power, wisdom, whatever it is, universal life force is making it act out. The only thing that is not connected is your mind. So the Sikh tradition forces the conversation around the mind and nothing else. It's literally mindset is spirituality. And a spiritual mind, a refined mind, is essentially what it is that you're trying to find. Because unfortunately, a lot of people have been misled into thinking that a silent mind is spirituality. And there is no such thing as a silent mind.
Good luck. And then I was like, don't interrupt him.
You cannot achieve a silent mind. The very act of mind is thoughts. That's literally what the mind does. Trying to get a silent mind is like trying to stop your heart beating. You can probably do it for a fraction of a time, but the function of the heart is to carry on beating. The function of the mind is to have thoughts. So rather than trying to have a silent mind, the Sikh tradition actually tries to do something different, which is saying, let's actually have a refined mind. Let's have a realistic view of what the mind does, which is the fact that it's constantly just throwing out thoughts. All the time, your mind is just this babble of thoughts. Well, can we control those? Can we actually steer those thoughts into a way that's actually healthy for you, into a way that's actually beneficial for you, rather than kind of going down random thoughts or even negative thoughts? So for me, spirituality is embedded in mindset. In fact, the very word for spirituality in our tradition is called having a guru-like mind, having the mind of a guru, having the mind of a spiritual master. The opposite of that is the ego mind. And that's essentially what all human beings are battling between, the ego mind and the guru mind. So most of us have an ego mind where life is all about me. And the spiritual masters are saying, life has nothing to do with you, and you need to change your thought processes. You need to have a refined way of thinking that actually sees what the ultimate truth is, rather than this kind of ego-based truth that we're all carrying around. So I think mindset, you cannot have spirituality without mindset.
Sorry, pardon me. The podcast is about to dive deep into what the refined mind looks like. Just before we go into that, there's a picture, and pardon me for doing this. There's a picture of me. There's a picture in my mind of you standing at like one of the big four banks telling them, hey, you've got ego mind and you've got guru mind. And then I'm like, he actually does this for a living. Like, how does that conversation get received? Pardon me, we will talk about refined mind, but can you answer that question first, please?
So what did you mean about standing in front of a bank? I don't try to sell this on the street to anyone.
I'm not talking about your soapbox, which you do on the weekend. So no, we've got YouTube for that now, thankfully. No, I mean, as in you're doing a lot of corporate clients, and I see you actually going into organizations and coming in to talk about mindset and stuff like that, which is really powerful. And then, it's pretty trippy to feel into what you're sharing here, being received in some really interesting spaces.
Yeah, I think one of the things that I've tasked myself with or challenged myself with is, can you make ancient spiritual wisdom accessible to everyday people, the modern world, the modern mind? And it has to relate to the common man. If it doesn't, then you're doing something wrong, then you're teaching something wrong. And part of what I've tried to do is really go back and look at that ancient wisdom, look within myself and say, well, what's really going on and how do I simplify it? And I've been very fortunate that, I've got my own kids, and I've tried from a very young age to explain these concepts to them. So from the age of about 2 years old, they've been listening to me trying to explain this to them. And part of what that does is that forces you to simplify things to such a basic level that even a child can understand it. And that forces you to really clarify your own thought process. And, I think it was Einstein that said, if you can't explain something simply, then you don't understand it. And so you really have to dig deep within yourself and say, what is the core and how does it apply to everyone? And hopefully, and it's an ongoing struggle, but I think hopefully we've reached a stage where you can explain some pretty deep spiritual ideas to anyone, regardless of whether they consider themselves spiritual, religious, or atheist or whatever. There is a truth that applies to everyone. And if you're able to kind of cut through and speak to people, you can really begin to start seeing some shifts where people understand in a language and are receiving the information without feeling like they're being judged for not practicing your tradition or your religion, but sincerely just receiving wisdom and thinking, oh, this is actually relevant to me. This is actually something I can just go back into my daily life and try and practice some way. So that's a very important thing that I try and do, that make this relevant for everyone.
I love that. Thank you for answering some of my trippier questions and diving deep into there then. Refined mind. So we've talked about there are some truths that are waiting in there for us when it comes to our mindset. What are some of those? What are some of the pillars of a refined mind, in your opinion?
I think first and foremost, we must go back to what is the ultimate truth. Unless you define the ultimate truth, people will not know what is the destination, what's the peak of that mountain that they're trying to reach. The ultimate truth that is true for all people at all times and in all places is life is nothing to do with you. It's much bigger than you. This is not your story. And that is the first step. That is the first truth that you must begin to understand. And if you're not willing to go down that route, if you're not even curious about where that path could take you, you're immediately going to create a barrier and say, no, my life is about me. It's all about me. I'm here to make my life better. And the spiritual masters have said, well, good luck. We've seen that, and we've seen where that path is going to go. That's only going to lead to misery. Because think about it. If nothing else, where is the end of the line for your life? Everybody knows that there is an end. Yeah. And if you think life is all about you, well, your life is going to end. So let's start with that ultimate truth, that your life is going to end. In 100 years, nobody's going to even be around to remember your name. That's how meaningless your life really is. And this can come across as quite harsh, but once you can overcome that and say, okay, well, what if you're saying that life has nothing to do with me, what is life to do about? And that's where you can take a step back. I like to think of the example of when you have a camera lens and you zoom in too close, the image is fuzzy. You have to zoom out, and then the image starts to become clear. And so right now we're all living a fuzzy life because we are so zoomed into our own story that we can't see what's really happening. The ultimate truth is that there is simply life here. There is an unfolding of life. That's literally how you were born, that your parents gave birth to you. And how did they get born? You just come from a line of just this ongoing human story that goes back right to the beginning of time. And you are simply one little cog in this much larger story of life, of the universe. And once you can begin to see that there is a bigger perspective that you haven't had access to, that you haven't been privy to, then you can start to say, well, okay, how do I live my life now knowing that I'm a very small fragment of this larger truth? So a refined mind first has to start accepting some ultimate truths that are out there. And when we can start to see those things, when we can become comfortable that actually there is a whole bunch of other stuff that's going on here. There is an entire story that's going on here that is far greater than me. Can I now align myself with that truth? That's the start of your spiritual journey. That's the start of your refined mind, is to move the story away from yourself and start to see the bigger picture, the oneness, call it whatever you want, give it whatever name you want, but start to understand there's something far bigger going on. That's the beginning of the journey. Because if you don't have that, your mind is completely stuck in this egocentric view of the world, which is life is all about me. Everything is about me. I need to get everything for my life, for my husband, my wife, my kids, my family, my home, my job, my career, my friends. Everything is about you. And the reality is none of those things are going to last. None of those things are going to stay. So how do you actually create a life that is about something bigger? And I think that's the beginning of the journey of starting to refine your way of thinking to move away from self-importance. And once you understand those two things, you're beginning to start seeing, yeah, there is a way of living. There is a way of living that these spiritual masters have figured out that we haven't quite figured out yet.
What is one of the functions of the Leela, which is the play, which is the marketplace, whatever you want to call it? Because there's a lot of individual promoting going on in the marketplace. It's very much so like, hey, get these sneakers, or come, get this cologne, or check out this or check out that, and check out my car, check out my house. So that seems at odds a little bit with this concept of it's not so much about me. It seems like I'm generalizing, but mass media marketing is a bit more like you, as in me a little bit.
Yeah, we are absolutely in a culture that massively promotes the ego and self-importance. And we're taught this from school, right from a young age. When everyone's forced to do an exam, you're pressurized to be the top of the class. It starts with you first. And when you go out there, you're into the corporate world, into the working world. You have to get the interview. You have to win that job. You have to get the promotion. And everything that we're bombarded with are ideas that reinforce the ego, because that's what the whole world is doing. The whole world is in their own ego. And so that's all we know. That's all that we can promote to each other. And so are we now going to somehow solve this problem? Are we going to change the entire world? I think you would be pretty foolish to try and do that. So you used a really interesting word, the Leela. This is the play. The word Leela means the play of God. This is just the way life has been created. The question for you is not how do I change the world? The question for you is how do I change myself? That is the thing that you need to focus on. How do I refine my life and the world, this tiny opportunity that I have to be alive for who knows how many years? What can I do to make sure that I'm not drowning like the rest of the world is? Because the world really is drowning. They're drowning in their own desires. They're drowning in their own obsessions. They're drowning in their own crazy ladders that they're trying to climb in all aspects of their life. And nobody is happy. Everyone is miserable. So are we now going to start playing that game, or can we take a step back and say, oh, I can see this game. I can see life for what it is, but I'm not going to play it this way. I'm going to play it in a completely different way. There's a beautiful analogy that I think works really well with this. Have you ever played a game with a child, like a board game, where they're taking the game far too seriously, like a game on Monopoly or chess or something like that? And they are playing in a way like if you take one of their pieces away, or if they lose something, they're completely distraught. And you as an adult, you're taking a step back and saying, hey, it's just a game. Why are you playing this game so seriously? Play Play it to your heart's content, but know that there's nothing real about this. What's interesting is the spiritual masters are looking at adults in exactly the same way. We're all playing the game of life like everything is so serious, and the spiritual masters are looking at us in exactly the same way, saying, why are you taking this game so seriously? You're eventually going to lose all your pieces. Play like that. Know that you're playing to lose everything ultimately, and be content with that. Be content with playing the game in that way. And I think that gives you a whole different perspective about how you sort of play the game of life.
Yeah, that's a really great metaphor, and you can really see spiritual maturity sort of stand out there. That's actually really easy to identify. Thank you for that. So one of the pillars, making sure, or coming to terms with the fact that your life is not about you, seems to be an opening point. Diving deeper into the refined mind, is there more to uncover in that?
The entire spiritual journey is then refining that mind, and then let's figure out what are the key things that are causing our mind to struggle. And essentially those things are, number one, top of the list is desire. That is the ultimate thing that we are all struggling with.
Even the desire to be desireless. So I've found
100%.
myself wrapped up in that one a couple of times.
One.
Like, how can I just please just desire a little less? And then it's like, you're still playing into it, homie.
Yeah. The desire to be spiritual.
Sorry, I'm interrupting.
Yeah. The desire to be spiritual, the desire to be the best yogi or to reach some kind of spiritual height, the desire to be enlightened is just another desire. And once you can start to see that your mind has just played a different game now it's just going down this kind of spiritual desire rather than this material desire, you're still kind of trapped in that loop of desire. And so what does an unrefined mind look like? Is a mind that is constantly craving to change the scenario in some way. Never satisfied with what is happening in this very moment, always wanting something else than the truth that is happening right now. And this is one of the greatest teachings from Guru Nanak and the Sikh wisdom that has been brought to the world is, can you go with the flow of life? Can you be comfortable with whatever life throws at you and be okay with knowing that life is constantly going to keep changing and not wanting to change the scenario in some way? And one of the greatest teachings of all spiritual masters is that they've showed us that even when life became really difficult for them, they were in a state of bliss and peace. I mean, we have, even going back to recent times, we have Buddhist monks that would set themselves on fire in protest against a war, and they just sit in meditation. Even when their own body is literally burning, they're at peace. I mean, that is the level that the human body and the human mind is capable of reaching. And so think about how practiced they are in not wanting to change this moment, that even when their body is on fire, they're literally sitting in peace. And we see this time and time again with many spiritual masters within the Sikh tradition, within other traditions, that are being faced with torture and death, and they're remaining absolutely at calm, at peace. In fact, they're in bliss. That's what these masters have taught us, that you need to learn how to live life in this way, no matter what's going on. And we get frustrated when, you know, when we've ordered something online and the delivery is a couple of hours late. That's how easily our mind gets agitated. Or when we're stuck in traffic and we're meant to be somewhere on time and we didn't expect this. Or even when the weather changes, our mind gets completely agitated. That's how fickle our mind is compared to these spiritual masters. And it shows us how far we have to go. And so accepting reality as it is right now is one of the most fundamental lessons in any spiritual tradition.
I love that. Anything else standing out to you as one of the cornerstones of human suffering as well?
Wanting to change the world, desires, frustration, angers, greed, those are those things that are just happening to us all the time. The other thing is being in a state of bliss starts to become this unrealistic goal that most spiritual seekers are trying to get to. And so then they go down their own frustrations. They start to blame themselves, and they start to kind of become quite negative within themselves. And they don't accept that also the mind has a certain journey that it has to go through itself. And so starting to beat yourself up in spirituality is something that you need to also be aware of, that the mind is what it is. And you start to take a step back and not be somebody who's beating yourself up for something that you didn't control. You didn't create this mind. Can you simply accept that your mind is like a child? Can you take a step back from even the thoughts that are coming up and not even judging your own thoughts, but simply saying, they are what they are. This is what it is. I don't create these thoughts. They simply come up. And that can only happen when you start to have a practice that separates yourselves from your thoughts. And we're sort of starting to touch upon the value of meditation and the role that meditation actually plays, is that you start to become separate from a thought that appears within your mind. And the truth of the matter is, most people have not learned how to create a distinction between their true selves and the thoughts that are coming in their mind. They don't know how to do it. They haven't observed their thoughts. They haven't even become aware that they are not their thoughts. And I know that these are spiritual things that yogis and spiritual gurus are saying in all traditions, but that's because there's a truth in that. You are not the creator of your thoughts. And most people just haven't even begun to recognize that difference, that every thought that comes in my mind isn't me. It isn't my inner voice. It's just the voice that's going on. And that's just a reflection of all the different things that I've been exposed to. You don't actually create your own thoughts. And most people are just so uneducated about their own mind. It's surprising how little we get taught about our mind in our schooling system, in our society, and all those things. And yet when our mind goes tumbling down, somehow we are surprised. Well, we've never trained this mind. We've never even studied it. We've never looked at it. And I think that's what I love about spiritual practice, is that it's stopping you from looking outside and saying, what are you doing? Change your diet, change your clothing, change this, change that about your lifestyle. Actually, no, just observe your mind. Just look at what's going on and start to see, can I refine this? Can I improve what's going on in my inner space?
Hey, your Inspired Tribe. I want to take a quick sec. I wanted to share something today with you that is really dear to my heart. And it's actually what keeps the entire ecosystem around the Inspired Evolution thriving, my one-on-one coaching. So it's basically coaching that helps you live a spiritually aligned life. I coach people from all different types of walks of life. These people are leaders and they're looking to have an incredible spiritual impact in the lives that they're leading for themselves, and then also lead in alignment to their values. Now, you don't have to take my word for it. Here's a few people that have also transformed through my coaching, and here's what they have to say.
Amrit is a fantastic coach.
In a few sessions, he got to a depth that I'd only experienced before working with certain medicines.
He's gone through a lot of the struggles that you're probably facing.
Then my corporate banking job wasn't really doing it.
You feel like you're not making progress towards your goals.
And Amrit's been a really strong, supportive figure in my journey.
I'm more in control of myself.
I'm kinder to myself.
I actually have that vision and a purpose.
I do feel like I'm a better version of myself already.
Amazing energy.
He was easy to talk to, which made me easy to trust him.
Working with Amrit at 9 o'clock on a Saturday morning, and really I was bouncing out of bed.
Whenever I get off the calls with Amrit, best money we've ever spent.
I would not recommend him because I don't want everyone to know about him and then I won't be able to book him. If he gets too busy, I won't get my turn.
I would say absolutely.
There's no way you can work with Amrit for a period of time without being transformed.
So if you're considering him as a coach, do not hesitate, because you won't be disappointed.
As you guys can see, there's a lot of people all over the world from all these different corners experiencing incredible transformations. I don't think, if I can say humbly myself, that there is anything quite like this somewhere else online. Most people that, have channels that, grow and grow and grow don't really focus on one-to-one offerings. I have just found that it is the most profound space where you can bring yourself in a private container and really just share what's going on for yourself. And if you want to book in for that call with me, touch base, it's www.amrit.coach/life. That's www.amrit.coach/life. amrit.coach/LIFE. There is a link in the show notes below to book in that call. And yeah, if you want to take your journey further, if you want to dive in deeper, and you really want to live a spiritually aligned life, if it's for you, please do check it out. And without too much further ado, once again, for your spirit, for yourself, today's podcast. Yeah, it's especially the way you're articulating it. It's a bit of a, I don't want to say it's a slap in the face because that makes you sound harsh, but it is a bit of a wake-up call. Let's put it that way. It's like you spend so much time in your mind and yet you're not educated about it. It's like I spend pretty much 24/7, 365 up in here. It's like, what do I actually really know about you? And, you know, one of the interesting things we talked about, pain and cracking open before, if it was, I struggled with, you know, quite a bit of a mental health journey there myself. And if it wasn't for that, I wouldn't have come to mindfulness and meditation and actually learning of all the neuroses, touch with it, the mind can present with, and learning to be like, oh, that's just my noise. It's not actually my noise. You know, it's quite the distillation. And it's not actually easy because it takes a consistent practice. Something you've got to sit with and sort of refine again and again and again and again. And actually, the more you do it, it's almost like the grip sort of loosens, you know, of the pattern that you've been adopting for some time. There are some really great parts to, in particular, the faith that, you know, that we ascribe to, the concept of Simran. Maybe you can give us the English translation of it and explain how something like that is also supportive for those tuning in, and how they can adopt something for their own, you know, modality and understanding their own analogous equivalent into their life. Yeah.
I think Simran is one of these concepts which are so unique to the Sikh tradition that most people haven't actually learned that there are multiple different spiritual paths and there are unique different opportunities available to you. A lot of the time, we touched upon before, people seem to think that meditation is about simply just calming the mind and finding a state of silence and silencing the mind. What the Sikh tradition tries to do, and the masters recommend, is they recognize that the mind is always talking. And so what they say is, if your mind is always talking, why don't we change the words that are going on in your mind? Because your mind is always going to be saying something. So why don't we actually control that narrative rather than just letting the mind keep saying whatever it is that it wants to say next? And so the word Simran means remembrance. And this is the Sikh meditative path. What they say is, all you need to do is remember. You need to remember that you are part of something greater, that this is life that's going on right now. It's not you that's going on. It's not your story. It's simply the story of life that's unfolding right now. Remembrance doesn't need you to sit down and do it at a certain time in the morning. It doesn't need you to stop your day and get into a yogic posture and close your eyes. It doesn't need you to do any of that. You simply just need to remember as you're going about your daily life. So while you're driving to work, while you're in the shower, while you're cooking, while you're sitting in a meeting, can you be in a state of remembrance? Now the question is, well, how do you do it? And this is where they offer something called Naam. And an easy way to think about Naam, the word Naam means the name. When you understand the vastness of the universe, give it a word. Give it one word. And I call it like your trigger word. The thing that gets you out of your mind and just gets you back into that expansion, that awareness of totality, of oneness, of the universal life force. What is the word for you that steps you out of your mind and brings you back into that space? Use that word. Throughout your day, while things are going on, while your manager is telling you things and having a go at you for submitting the project late, and while you're stuck in traffic and all the things that frustrate your mind, take a step back. Use your trigger word. Use that Naam, that name that brings you back into that state of awareness, that brings you into that state of remembering who you really are, not who your ego mind has convinced you that you are. You are a part of the universal force of life. What is the word that you can use all day, all night, that just gets you back. And don't even be precious about the word. At some point, for a certain number of days or weeks, one word is going to work for you. And then after a while, you say, hey, this word is not really working for me. And then you just give it another word, and it's fine. Like I use the example that even for my own wife, I don't call her by her name. I have my own nicknames for her. And sometimes I feel like calling her in one way, and sometimes I feel like calling her in another way. They all mean the same thing. And so what is the word that's working for you right now that can just help you step back? And what I love about this wisdom is you can do this all the time, at any time, whatever is going on. Even while you're listening to me talking, don't put all of your focus on me. Have that little bit of awareness that's kind of taking you back to that ultimate understanding. What is helping you to remember? That's what the word Simran means. And it is genuinely such a transformative path. It's genuinely such a transformative wisdom, because it is for all people, all minds, all the time. Anyone can do it. You simply just have to be lucky enough to remember this, and then you can go back into practicing it, no matter where you are, no matter what you're doing, no matter what stage of life you're in. It doesn't matter how religious or unreligious or spiritual you are. It makes no difference. You can use this technique at all times. And I think that's what I mean about this is genuinely a path that's not designed for monks. You don't have to leave your life. You don't have to go join an ashram. You don't have to move into the Himalayas or do anything, change your robes, change your outfits, change your religious garments. You don't have to learn to speak another language. You don't have to read special prayers. Simply remember. What is the one name that you're going to use to help you remember?
Yeah, as you're sharing that, there's a word that's present for me, which is universe, and I think it's just such an accessible word for so many of us. Which is, you can just remember the universe. Yeah. And one of the other things that's present for me as you started to say, focus on me, but then also reflect on your word. I started doing that. Pardon me, I should be paying better attention. But I was paying attention. I was going along on the journey that you were prescribing. And so in there, one of the things that emerged for me was also one of the meditations I put together was on compassion. And the interesting thing about this compassion meditation is it doesn't really ask you to be compassionate. There's no, hey, find compassion within yourself. The journey of the meditation basically starts with, hey, bring to mind someone or something or a pet or something you love. Find them deep within your heart and just think about them for a second, and just allow that warmth that you feel to sort of come into play. And then see if you can expand that warmth to cover your body. See if you can expand that warmth to cover the room. See if you can expand that warmth to cover your house, your city, your state, your country, your hemisphere, your planet, your universe, right? And the interesting thing is it's just you expanding and just holding that remembrance of hey, I can actually be this big. And the trickle-down economics of expansion just happens to be that later on in the day, they found studies of this, that you end up being more compassionate because you're holding a larger state of awareness. And I really love that because of as you're sharing what you're sharing, is just remember that you are part of this one larger story, larger whole. There are a lot of things that get passed down through there that are, potentially not being discussed in the conversation as trickle down, I don't want to say moral benefits, but trickle down economics in terms of benefits for your life as well. Yeah.
This is, I love that meditation, and certainly I've practiced it, and I've taught something similar. And I think it's so important for people to understand compassion in the teachings of Guru Nanak. He simply says that compassion is the mother of religion. If you don't have compassion, you don't have religion. You don't have spirituality. And that is literally the place that you should be coming from. Compassion for all things, namely because you begin to realize that most people are simply acting out their programming. Most people are not even in control of what they're doing. I heard this beautiful example the other day. Someone says that if you get bitten by a snake, you don't blame the snake. You understand that that's just his nature.
Mm.
And you don't hold a grudge against the snake. That's literally just what it does. You try and now fix yourself and heal yourself, but you don't have direct venom towards that snake. You understand his nature. If you can apply that same thinking to all human beings, then compassion now takes a whole new meaning, because you don't have space to hold a grudge against another person, because you know that they didn't act out of their highest self. They acted out of their lowest mental states. They acted out of their own greed and their own possessiveness and their own desires. They acted out of a sense of separation from everyone else. They didn't even consider anyone else as important. They considered themselves to be more important. So compassion for all beings is so fundamental, because not because you're better than them. And I think this is something very important about ideas of compassion and forgiveness. And in fact, within the Sikh tradition, forgiveness is not even taught, because forgiveness is something that is steeped in duality. Forgiveness literally says, you are a bad person. You did something wrong. I am higher than you, and I'm going to now forgive you. I'm better than you. And there's a real ego in this idea that I forgive you.
Right.
Yeah. As opposed to, this is all the play of life. There is simply two pieces of a chessboard, and you happen to be on one side and I happen to be on the other side, and that's just how the game has unfolded. And so you now start to not empathize with somebody who's oppressed you or who's done something wrong to you, but you can certainly begin to see that they didn't understand what they were doing. And in fact, that's also where self-forgiveness comes in from. So many times I hear from people that say, I can't let go of what I did in the past. I can't believe I did this. I can't let go of who I used to be. And I ask them a very simple question. Knowing what you know now, would you go back and do the same thing? And they say, well, of course not. I said, well, why did you do it back then? Because I didn't know. Back then, I didn't know. If you were now taken back to that moment, knowing what you know now, you wouldn't do it. But if you were back in that same moment with the same mindset that you had, you would do the same thing again and again. So you have to forgive who you were back then, as just that's what the story was. That's how the game was unfolding back then. So these are really powerful and healing meditations that genuinely start to lift us out of some of the baggage that we carry ourselves and carry for years or lifetimes for a lot of people.
I did a podcast with a gentleman named Neil Donald Walsh. I'm not sure if you've come across his work. He wrote a series of books called Conversations with God.
Conversations with God.
And and he wrote one of the podcasts was dedicated to forgiveness, and you inadvertently said exactly what he was saying by same intention, which he said forgiveness in the eyes of the master just dissolves into understanding. It just dissolves into understanding. And similar to what you're saying about compassion, it's hurt people. You know, we hear that saying. And I remember a couple of friends of mine were actual this is pretty trippy, but they were ex-Osho sannyasis. You know the Osho sannyasis, have you heard? And then Osho made them do these really trippy dippy experiments. One of the ones was they were locked in a room and they weren't allowed to come out until they energetically killed their mother and their father. And now I'm not advising anybody to do this, but this was one of the exercises. Trippy dippy old Osho mate, as incredible as his teachings are, got these two people to do. Very cathartic, very embodied. And both of them said, actually, when they came out of the experience, having, slain their own parents, which is, well, even saying that out loud, I feel a bit conscious on a podcast, touch wood. But yeah, one of the things they both said was they were walking around, because I asked about the transformation. It was like, you did this for a transformative experience. What was the transformation? And the awareness was that they were looking around at everybody that they saw for the next however long. And it was just, you were just seeing people as almost like computer chips with just like a certain amount of information and just being able to process data with the amount of information they had. And they were just like, everybody is just doing the best they can with what they know. Everybody is just doing the best they can with what they know. If they knew better, they'd be doing differently. Not to say that they don't know better and they should be doing better. It's just everybody, myself included, is doing the best I can with what I know, And there's a real when I heard that, there was also this real, because I call everybody brother and I call everybody sister. It's probably also a function of me being an only child. I'm yearning for siblingship. But then also there is, I think that sort of also unpacks that sort of perspective a little bit. It's like we're all in this together. Trying to figure out the best way forward. And it can be quite convoluted at times, and just that little bit of extra compassion or an extra shoulder here and there can be quite supportive. I'm noticing a segue naturally coming into the concept of service and seva, but we've already talked about our life not being about us. Is there more to be said about seva and about service in your opinion? I mean, there's a whole podcast in there, but sorry, you're just at the moment. Yeah.
It's very interesting that we're now in a world where talking about concepts like God is really frowned upon. But one of my challenges is I really want to bring the idea of God back to people in a way that's palatable for the modern world. And I think there is an old version of God, which is this kind of old man with a white beard sitting in the clouds, directing every aspect of your life. And I don't think that's what God is. And I don't think God was ever that. I almost prefer terms like Mother Nature as a version of God that I think most people can subscribe to, that everything is like your mother. And when you treat everything as like your mother, then every interaction is an opportunity to serve. And that's what really that word seva that you've touched upon, it means service. If you recognize that everything is God, everything is like that divine Father, like that divine Mother, then it changes how you interact with everything and everyone, how you speak to people. You're no longer speaking to somebody who is your equivalent or your senior or your junior. You're speaking to the ultimate, that oneness. So it changes how you look at them, how you look into their eyes. It changes how you position yourself, because if you're always in front of God, you're always humbled. You're always lower. So I love the idea of service, because it's so opposite to the idea of charity. Charity is, I have more than you, so out of the goodness of my heart, I'm going to give something to you. So you're positioning yourself from a place of abundance and having more and being higher. Seva, service, is the opposite. You are the king and I'm your humble servant, and I'm just here to give you out of love, out of respect, out of devotion towards you, because you've given me so much. Think about Mother Nature. What hasn't nature given you? You've given me so much that I'm simply indebted to you in so many ways. There's a beautiful verse in the Sikh tradition that says, you've given everything. I don't even know what I could give you that wasn't yours to begin with. Right? And that is the mindset of service, that ultimately the only thing that I have left to give is myself. I'm just going to dedicate myself to you. And if you can start to recognize life as God, as everything is that divine spirit, then everything becomes sacred. Everything becomes worthy of your service. Nothing is lower than you. Everything is higher than you, because everything is that one, that ultimate one being, that true universal source that sits inside all of us. If you can begin to recognize that, seva is a phenomenal way to live your life.
Yeah, it's interesting as well, because I find it's starting to creep into more and more into social enterprise and the common vernacular as well. I find entrepreneurs talking like, really, let's serve well, let's serve love, let's figure out how to serve. And I'm like, this is kind of cool. People be waking up. And like you said, it's timeless, right? It's timeless. And yeah, it really helps you get out of your own way. And also, I think there's a lot to be said, and not to allow the ego structures to sort of latch themselves onto something so pure as service, but also strangest stuff happens when you start to surrender into service. Like when you actually just follow into service just give yourself up that way, the stuff that starts to like open up, because this is that flow, right? The surrender that I guess you were speaking to, what Baba Nanak was initially alluding to, right? Any thoughts to add to what opens up?
I think we've got to be very careful that there isn't a small amount of expectation in service that's kind of sitting in the background quietly.
Then it robs the pure intention.
Then it's not selfless.
Yeah.
Then it's not selfless service. Selfless service is genuinely, I am here to give, and with no expectation. In fact, the reason of me giving is because I've been given so much. My life is so abundant and full, and the universe has given me so much that there's no reason for me to hold on to some of that stuff. I like to think of the analogy of when you've watched a great movie or you've listened to a great piece of music, you can't help but go and tell your friends and say, hey, have you heard this song? Hey, have you watched this movie? You have to watch this. You're not doing that for anything in return. In fact, you've been so overwhelmed and you're so full that you simply want to share that fullness with other people. So you're not doing it with an expectation to get anything back. And when you act with zero care for what it's going to do for you in the end, whether life changes for you, whether new opportunities open, whether anything happens for you, that is irrelevant. You're simply there to continue to serve. And by service, you don't have to go out of your way. I think that's very clear, and that's why you can simply see every moment as an act of service. How can I serve this moment? What can I do right now? What can I do when I just meet a stranger down the street? Maybe a smile is simply an act of service. Maybe that's all you need to do. Maybe that's that one thing that could change that person's day.
Thank you. I've got a question going back to compassion about judgment. And the interesting thing is, I've been doing some interviews recently, and for the longest time, the opposite of love was positioned as fear. And then some people have espoused it to be hate. And then recently it seems to be circling more and more around judgment. So I think everybody has their own interpretation. Maybe it comes down to the individual in terms of what their unique makeup is and, what their life path and life journey is as to what they see the opposite of love as being. But I think judgment's a really interesting one to sort of recognize, because it's quite tangible. It's quite palpable. I think even, sometimes we find ourselves saying, oh, I'm not judgmental, I'm just being discerning. And it's like, no, you just you just crept in the back door there, mate. And yeah, I think there's a real interesting.
It's an interesting one, because you definitely need to be able to recognize when a thought that is happening in your mind is coming from a sense of superiority. And ultimately, that's what judgment really is. What you're really saying is, when you're looking down at someone, when you're talking about them, when you're gossiping about them behind their back, what you're really saying is, at least I'm not like that. I would never be like that. And to the spiritual practitioner, they're very acutely aware of their ego coming back and their sense of self-importance. And so that's why spiritual masters have been very strict to say, don't ever criticize anyone. Don't ever look down on anyone. Don't even be in the same room where a conversation is going on, where there's just gossip and negativity and criticism going on. You've got to be very vigilant against some of those things. Because why? Because the spiritual seeker is trying constantly to kind of battle with the sense of self-importance and ego. And so when you judge somebody else, you're simply bringing your self-importance back up. Having said that, there is something to be said about being critical and standing up for injustice, standing up when things just need to be done. When, there's turmoil happening all over the world. There's awful things that are happening that we see on the news. If you stay silent and do nothing, what does that say about you? What does that say about your ego, your compassion? A lot of the times we say nothing out of fear. I don't want to do anything. I don't want to stir the hornet's nest. I just want to stay quiet and just live my own kind of spiritual life. I want to just go and meditate in my own little cave. And the reality is, at times you do need to just stand up and say, enough's enough. Not from a state of judgment, but almost from a state of compassion. That what is going on around you somebody needs to stand up for what's going on. And so there is this fine balance between judgment and standing up for what's right. And I think that's some of the almost the warrior mindset that the Sikh is trained on, is knowing how to recognize the difference. At times you do need to stand up. At times you need to say something. That
does bring us into a topic that is very dear to my heart. There's this concept of the warrior saint. I don't know how, I think it's hard to be a Sikh without being exposed to that one. It's you've touched on it a little here. Can we go deeper into what really is meant by this concept of the warrior saint in your awareness, in your opinion?
The ultimate act of service is that you're willing to lay down your own life for the benefit of somebody else. That is the ultimate mindset of a warrior. And that only happens for the spiritually enlightened. For somebody who has firstly battled their own ego so much that they have no desire to even stay alive for the wrong reasons. When you are so comfortable with the flow of life, you're so comfortable that life can change at any moment, that even at any moment, death can come and take you. You're very comfortable with those things, that you've built your spiritual practice, then you've become a spiritual warrior. And then your actions are going out into the world and saying, what can I do to help people? It's not that you're going to go look for a fight. It's not that you're trying to go out of your way to become a martyr in some way. That's not what you're looking for. But you're simply always prepared. And I think that's what the idea of a spiritual warrior is somebody who's always prepared for anything. And they are so comfortable with letting go of their own life that if the situation presents itself that they need to do something that is right for someone else, they don't hold on to their ego and say, I'm going to protect me first, and I'm not going to worry about what somebody else is going to do. And I think so. There's what the Sikh tradition does very well is it shows this perfect synergy between being a spiritual master and being a warrior, because they go hand in hand. A warrior is spiritual, a spiritual is warrior. That's that perfect union between the two. And it was born out of some of the turmoil that was happening at the time of when these Sikh masters and the spiritual masters were around. There was incredible injustice going on in India at that time. There was literally dictators coming in and causing mass genocide. And what you had was a religious class, a priestly class that was doing nothing about it. And some of the spiritual masters that emerged out of that time were simply saying, you can't sit back. You can't really call yourself spiritual if you're going to sit back and do nothing. You have to stand up. You have to say something, do something, even an act of defiance, and simply standing up and saying something, the truth that needs to be spoken. That is the mindset of a warrior. A warrior isn't always that's kind of running with a sword in his hand and there to kind of, pick a fight and start a battle. The battle first starts from your willingness to just kind of stand up and stand up for what's right.
I'm hearing, the being complicit in your silence as well. And the interesting thing also, I think in the 3D, I also feel, because we were talking about mindset earlier, there's that the warrior saint also, that it can be a bit of a war inside with, like you said, trying to divert some of these thoughts that we've got. It takes a bit of a waging. I like to use the word waging peace a lot. I use it heavy-handedly. Maybe it's just something I'm addicted to. But I don't know. It just sounds really like it does feel like that. There's people waging war, and sometimes I probably wouldn't want to wage war in my own mind, but waging peace within my own mind. It's like, and the waging concept is like this warrior concept. Is like I've actually got to go out after it. And I think the more I'm just speaking out loud of it with you, it's like the warrior saint does sound very much like waging peace. And one of my contemplations that always gets me is this, a friend of mine gave me this. It was like, I'd rather be a warrior in a garden than be a gardener in a war. It's just every time I just picture this like gardener standing in the middle of a battlefield, just going, shit.
Being totally useless at that point. Yeah. I love that phrase. I think, you know, that there's a beautiful example of the mind and the negative emotions that we feel as almost being enemies that we're trying to slay. And in the Sikh tradition, there's verses that say that my ego, my desire, my anger, my frustrations, these are like these huge enemies that I'm trying to fight. And do I have what it takes to fight these enemies? And what they say is that you fight them with love. You fight them with the wisdom. You arm yourself. You kind of robe yourself with the armor of spiritual wisdom, with the guru's teachings, with the higher wisdom. And that is how that you can defeat some of these things around you. But it can feel like a battle. It can feel like a war that's going on within your mind, because it's constantly there. No matter how much you learn and no matter how much you practice, sometimes thoughts will come up and you're just like, where did that come from? Why is that still there? How come that is still not something that I've managed to overcome? And I think you begin to realize that is what I mean about the mind never being silent. It always has the ability to drag you back down. The question is, when those thoughts arrive, have you practiced enough, or do you know what to do with those opponents? Those opponents are always going to come.
I could talk to you about justice. I could talk to you about hukum. There's a lot of questions still left in there, but I'm conscious of the time we have. And one of the questions that I really wanted to dive deeper is, we do have this, like, the teachings are so practical and so profound from a mindset level. And there's also something to be said, which we haven't really traversed into here today, which is, I know for a lot of people tuning into this conversation, religion may not be their cup of tea, but there is something to be said for sacred texts, in that absolutely, you know, there's the knowledge that you're reading on a surface level, but then there's also this, I don't know why I'm trying to avoid the word transmission, but there is a transmission, right, that is also present, when you start to approach, maybe it's your own reverence, but there is also something divine in these texts that people have, you know, there is some power and energy when you think about the way people organize themselves around these texts as well. For you to, just open up a container a little bit further around, yes, you know, there's the stuff that we can interpret, but then there's also some interpretable stuff that is also felt sense when we start to approach some of these more, sacred artifacts in and around religion, which I admittedly might not be everybody's cup of tea.
The way I look at the various sacred texts is, throughout mankind's history, there have been a small number of human beings that have figured out the human mind. And those people wrote down, through the goodness of their own heart, through their compassion for humanity, they didn't just die with that wisdom. They wrote those teachings down so that more and more people could benefit from it. And any tradition that is about how to live a better life, how to navigate through some of the difficulties that all human beings go through, it's surprising when you read ancient texts and you see how relevant they are to the human experience. They literally are just talking about everyday human experience. That's where you start to realize that there is something that is true for all human beings. There is the human experience that we've been going through the same way that people have been going through for hundreds, if not thousands of years. That's why those texts are sacred. They're not just sacred in their own right. They're not sacred because a group of people just surround themselves and call it sacred for that sake. It's sacred because of its timeless wisdom and its ability to heal the human mind. And when you see it through that lens, you don't need to be religious to take away that wisdom. Just like you don't need to follow a particular religion in order to go into a bookstore and just pick up a book that takes your fancy and start to read it and learn from those things. So when we start to see communities form around this, then inevitably there are certain practices, certain ways of speaking, certain rituals, traditions that come with that, because people have created a lifestyle around practicing what's written in that particular text. And so that's where people start to then see that there's so much other paraphernalia around it that it becomes a barrier towards picking up that wisdom. And what I always say to people is, ignore the traditions, ignore everything that you call religion, and go straight to the text. Start to pick that up, even if it's a translation of it, even if you can't read it in its original language. Go and pick that up and start to see, what is the wisdom telling me? How do I apply it in my day-to-day life? And if it sticks and if it works for you, then you can start to look a little bit into, well, why do they practice it in that particular way? What are they doing that supplements their understanding of that wisdom? And maybe they may be doing something as simple as just, rather than getting up and being frustrated about what I need to do with work and my kids and my job and this and that and the other, and I need to get food in the oven, and I need to pack these clothes or put them in the wash. Rather than starting your day like that, maybe you wake up half an hour earlier and you meditate. And so you can start to see, oh, these people actually have a reason for what looks like a religious rule is really just a habit that they've started to use in their daily life to actually help them navigate and practice that wisdom throughout their days. So I'm very understanding of people who are afraid of religions and who want nothing to do with it. And what I say with them is, you should be very critical of these religions, because there's far too many people that are just blindly practicing them. I say, ignore the religions, go straight for the text, read the text, and if it makes sense, then you can start to see, how do you apply those things in your life.
This brings us to an interesting juncture in this conversation, and this is a bit of a personal one. So I think talking about, I can't really call the Sikh identity paraphernalia. I feel rude saying that, and it feels sacrilegious. So I'm not going to say that, but I think I'm using that as a segue into this particular conversation. Where around you and I both identify as Sikh, but harbor very different identities. Namely, like, if I took the beanie off, he literally, just literally like the antithesis of each other's identity. You've kept your hair, you've wrapped it up, and you've got the turban, and you've kept your hair and grown out a beard. And for myself, just completely clean shaven, head and beard. And yet in my heart of hearts, bones of bones, there is no one can tell me that I'm not a Sikh, which is really interesting, because there are actually there are pockets of people within a belief and a faith which will tell you what you are allowed to believe and not allowed to believe in certain ways. I'm not saying you're of that nature, but I think just an open, candid conversation around, just a personal one for me. Like, what are some of your thoughts in terms of me not having leaned into the identity of a Sikh? Your thoughts on that?
There's only one way that you or I should identify as a Sikh, and it is, do I follow and practice and learn from this particular wisdom? Am I a student of this particular teacher? It's like me saying that I am a student of Oxford University because I happen to live next door to it. You can't be a student of it if you just happen to live next door. You can't be a student of it if you went into the gift shop and bought the jersey and you're wearing something that says Oxford University. That doesn't make you a student. There are plenty of people who look like me, and I would not call them a Sikh. You looking like a Sikh is not the criteria. The question is, do you turn up to the class every day? Now, if you and I both turn up to the class every day and we're both paying attention to the lecturer and we're both learning this wisdom and we go back and we practice it, that is the meaning of a Sikh. The word Sikh literally means the student. So the student who turns up to the class and pays attention to the teachings, and remember, the teachings are 99% about your mind and your mindset, that is the definition of that student. That is who is actually a learner of this wisdom. So there are plenty of people around the world that identify as a Sikh just because they were born into a Sikh family, and they too should not be called a Sikh. They're just like people who happen to live in the same town as the university. You cannot be a student of that unless you are enrolled in the program and you're actually attending the classes and you're practicing what you're doing. Because, there are people that even attend the class and they sit at the back and they fall asleep. They're not a student, right? So we have to judge ourselves. Am I actually a student of this particular teacher? Am I learning from this particular teacher? And if you're not, it's fine. Then you go and learn from another teacher. But don't identify simply out of a sense of tradition, simply out of a sense of community, belonging, and all those things. Now, once you are a practicing student of this particular wisdom, you may then decide to add on and supplement your tradition with some of the other things that the teacher is recommending. So you may go into class 1 and all you're doing is learning the wisdom. And in class 2, you're actually learning how to practice some of these things. You have to do certain practice. You have to wear certain things. But by all means, by no means are those things the defining factor. The defining factor is always whether you're learning from it. Because you can't skip the first class. You can't skip year 1 and just go into year 3. And that's what, unfortunately, a lot of people do, is they just look like a Sikh. They just look like they're practicing that religion, but they're not. It's like you can't call me a Buddhist monk just because I shave my head and start wearing orange robes. That doesn't make me a Buddhist monk all of a sudden. And in the same way, not all Buddhists are also monks. Not all Buddhists have a shaven head and are wearing the robe. So that's my view of it. I just don't subscribe to the idea that you are a better Sikh or a worse one just because you look the part. In fact, that's exactly what was going on in all the previous religious traditions, was people was just getting lost in ritual and practice, and nobody was going to the heart of the message. And so that's almost what the religious traditions are trying to readdress, and certainly the Sikh tradition is trying to readdress and get people back into the true core of the wisdom, and not starting to divide yourself between I belong to this tribe and you belong to that tribe. I'm from this religion or that religion. That's the opposite of what the wisdom is trying to teach you.
Thank you for that, Satpal. Is the ode to spirituality ultimately unity?
Oneness, unity, oneness with all things, not just with other people. Sometimes when you talk about unity and oneness, they get translated as that everyone has to just get along. But for me, oneness is far deeper. Unity is much deeper. In fact, almost all the spiritual traditions, certainly that derive from India, the Eastern traditions, ultimately have the same goal. You must reunite yourself with that true nature of who you are, that one universal life force. Even the word yoga means union, to reunite back with that original source. So unity, yes, but at a far greater level than how society seems to understand words like unity and oneness.
Brother. This has been such an engaging conversation, and I'm, to say grateful for your time and energy. Obviously, I am, for you spending a moment with us here in time. You're actually spending some more moments here with us in time. You're coming down to Australia soon, actually going up and down the East Coast and seeing some other cities as well. And I'll put a link actually for those that are tuning in from Australia to be able to access just some of the events that are happening. But I'm also going to point some people to your YouTube because as much as what we've been discussing today, some of it's been around Sikhism, some of it's been, as you can tell, wider spiritual concepts. And I think the big thing you're championing there is people to come home to their own spiritual truth. It just so happens to be that you've found yours in your modality. And, there's just so much that's available and waiting for people. And taking away from this conversation, a big... just the pairing between spiritual development and mental health. And, 1 in 2 people, the stats are starting to are walking around anxious or depressed. That's a harrowing stat. And so maybe there is a dearth of spirituality that's really, at the heart of why such work is really, really coming to the fore, and, you're needed more than ever. So that to sort of say thank you for your time and energy here today, brother, but also thank you for who you are. I run a YouTube channel myself. Even just that alone, I know how much goes into. We talk about service. It's a whole journey, but it's great. You learn a lot on the way. But yeah, man, it's and just the downloads and the insights that you continue to share, man. It's not lost on me. Just the amount of love and energy you're pouring into that. So thank you so much for all of that.
Oh, thank you so much for your time. I mean, if anyone's been inspired by the work that I do or anything that we've had the conversations today, I always say, take the good and leave anything that you don't agree with. I've tried very hard to bring this wisdom out to everyone. We even have all of our content completely free online. So we even created a free 10-week course called Living with Wisdom. And you just go on there and I encourage people to just kind of take this wisdom and see what you can do with it. That's why we kind of called it Living with Wisdom, that it's just, you don't have to change your life. You don't have to join my religion or anything like that. Simply find ways to take this wisdom and practice it in your day-to-day life. So by all means, everyone's welcome to this truth because it is universal. It's for you, me, for everyone. It's for our grandparents and for our grandchildren. And I really hope that more people can just benefit from spiritual wisdom and enjoy happier lives, enjoy more blissful, peaceful lives. Isn't that what we're all looking for in the end?
Oh, totally, man. Couldn't have put it better myself. Thank you so much. Hey there, inspired soul. You've made it through all the way to the end of another episode. I can't tell you how inspired I am by your inspirations to evolve. Thank you so much for accompanying me on this journey. Please don't forget to subscribe to the channel. It helps with everything we're doing here. And on screen now for you to continue your journey further is a video. Go on, click on it, and I'll see you in the next one.